All right, good afternoon. My name is Jacob Benjamin, Director of Professional Services at Dragos, and I'd like to welcome you to part 3 of our final webinar of our ICS OT 2021 Cybersecurity Year in Review webinar series, this one titled Lessons Learned from the Frontlines. So I'm here with a few of my colleagues here from the Threat Operations Center. I'm here with Leslie Carhart, Director of Incident Response in North America, and I'm here with Greg Pullman, Principal Industrial Consultant, Gus Serino, Principal Industrial Hunter, and Todd Keller, Principal Industrial Penetration Tester. I have a couple of housekeeping items that I'm going to go through here. So this session is being recorded and the recording will be sent out after the webinar. So your lines have been muted, but we will still want to interact with you. So please use the Q&A to chat and submit any questions you have, and we'll answer them as we go. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So all right. So what is the year in review? We'll start off there. So historically, the industrial community was apprehensive about sharing information. And so Dragos created the year in review to provide much needed information and insights and to accelerate learning and address the challenges. And this is actually our 5th year running this report. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to call on each panel. They can introduce themselves, tell you a little bit about themselves. So first, I'd like to introduce Leslie. Please go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. My name is Leslie Carhart. I am the Director of North American Incident Response at Dragos. I lead our team of incident responders who respond to all different types of intrusions, which could be advanced adversary, commodity, or insider, against industrial networks. We perform forensics, investigations, threat hunting, and a variety of training services on the topic.
Thank you. And I'm looking forward to the perspective you'll add from the incident response team. And so next I'd like to introduce Greg Pullman, a Principal Industrial Consultant. Please go ahead and tell us about yourself, Greg.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. My name is Gregory Pullman, Principal Industrial Consultant within the Pro Services arm of the Threat Operations Center. I primarily work on architecture assessments, compromise assessments within different industry verticals and with different industrial clients of Dragos. And again, glad to be here and hopefully add some perspective.
Thanks so much, Greg. Gus, go ahead.
Thanks, Jacob. I am Gus Serino, Principal Industrial Hunter here at Dragos. I am on the OT Watch team. Our team's function is basically an add-on part of the Dragos platform. So Dragos customers who have the platform enlist us to monitor their environments. So we look for, evidence of malicious behavior, whether it's detection that's pre-built into the platform that fires, and we do proactive threat hunting, looking for things that detections haven't been written for, to look for evidence of malicious activity. So thanks, Jacob.
Thanks, Gus. Todd, you're up next.
Yeah, Todd Keller. I'm one of the principal pen testers here at Dragos. We primarily focus on penetration testing of OT environments. So in most cases, whether or not we can breach from the enterprise environment over to the OT environment, or if given a foothold in the OT environment, how could we create potential impacts or greater understanding as an adversary within an OT environment? Predominantly backgrounded in energy and nuclear, but a lot of chemical and other industrial sectors that we focus on as a group overall. Thank you.
Thanks, Todd. And as you can see, we've assembled this panelist with a variety of different perspectives to really talk about the lessons learned within our year in review report, specifically the frontline sections. And so you can see on my screen here, I've shared some of the key findings that we've tracked year over year. And so I'm going to talk about each of these findings and what they mean. And I'm looking to get a perspective from each of the panelists. Todd perhaps providing the red team perspective, Leslie on the incident response side, and so on and so on. And so that's the idea behind this webinar, and that's how we're walking through some of these key findings and lessons learned and our recommendations for the year. And then we'll also answer any questions that come in through the chat. So definitely throw those questions in there. I'll be screening them as I ask. So the first one I want to talk about here is limited to no visibility in OT. This is something we've been tracking for a long time. You can see it actually has gone down a little bit in 2021, a slight decrease from 2020. And but it is overall one of our number one findings that we find. And so I do want to talk, like, the first question I have here is for Todd, is how would a pen tester or an adversary that you're emulating as a pen tester, how would they use a lack of visibility in a customer's OT environment to their advantage?
Excellent question. Ultimately, as pen testers, in a lot of cases, what we're doing inside of the environment is noisy. It has a lot of logging attached to it and other things of that nature. So if we don't have much visibility into our OT environments, the pen testers ultimately have a green field in order to explore, poke and probe, and try and find out what is out there and how we can interact with it. And in most cases, we can do so without any form of blue team or defense individual actually finding what we're doing. And generally, we can pivot without any detection whatsoever in a lot of cases.
Awesome, thanks. My next question is for Gus. So Gus, the way you're doing threat hunting and things like that, how important is visibility to threat hunting? How does that help you in your role?
Yeah, visibility is everything, right? So talking about threat hunting, what it is, so, it's a hypothesis-based exercise. So whether it's, current threat intelligence that something, exploits are being observed against an ICS device currently, or it's past, events like, Trisis or something like that, where you're looking for TTPs that were used there. So the first thing we do is we take those TTPs or those artifacts, and we develop a hypothesis of what we're going to look for and how. And then the second thing, once you've developed that hypothesis, is to figure out, is it testable? And so is that information, is that data available in what you're looking for and what you're doing your threat hunting in? So if we don't have visibility into the environment, we don't have that data, we can't hunt for it. So, I mean, it's everything, I guess, is the short answer.
Thanks. Now, Greg, you help a number of customers on these architecture reviews and things like that on a daily basis. Where should defenders start building visibility? And maybe talk a little bit about, like, what does visibility really mean? Like how does it, what is it, and how can you increase it and things like that? And how do you suggest they start?
Sure. So I think from the defender's perspective, you have to start with understanding yourself and what your key business units are within your organization. And from there, I think you have to get a good grasp on enumerating the assets and the solid inventory, network inventory that is realized within that business unit. From there, you can track modified states and changes, which include configurations and versions deployed once you have that asset inventory. And then again, mapping those relationships back to the dependencies within that key network terrain. All of that goes a long way towards gaining a better clarity in where the biggest risks, cybersecurity risks, lie within your organization and your environment. And I think from my experience this last year, that's been most evident and most true within boundary environments, which again, going back to Gus and Todd's statement, allowing the network traversal into the ICS OT environment. If you can't see it, you don't know that it's there. And also really, having clear visibility over that key network terrain. If an adversary were to gain access to that, what is the business unit dependent upon for production, and how can we lower the risk there?
Thank you. And Leslie, what does visibility mean to incident response? Like, what's the relationship between those two things?
Yeah, so people learn some unfortunate truths about incident response when they're dealing with a crisis, when they're dealing with an incident. And one of them is that if you haven't done these things like understanding your architecture or having some ability to see what's going on in your environment put in place in advance of an incident, then that's something that is going to have to happen at the beginning of the incident response effort. If you have no network maps, you have no asset inventories, guess what? Myself or my team are going to need to come in and build those in order to do a proper investigation. We can't come in and do a detective work without some understanding of what's going on in the environment. So that takes away precious time during an incident of actual forensics work that we could be doing or analysis of the intrusion, just at high cost and taking away resources from the incident response effort, doing that in a pinch at the beginning of the response engagement. So I can't encourage people to do this in advance enough.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to poor security perimeters. And so this finding is really about things like poor network segmentation between corporate networks and OT networks, improper firewall configurations, things of that nature. And you can see it's gone down a little bit. It's gone down 11% this year. And one thing I do want to say about all of these findings is they're not necessarily the same customers being evaluated year over year. A lot of times they're new customers that come on board and do an architecture review and things like that. So it's not, this data isn't indicative of the same people consistently making mistakes. That's not true. We help everyone move along throughout the journey here. But overall, within the OT industry, we still see very strong issues with poor network security perimeters. And so in that case, anyone on the panel here, any one of you have an example of some poor perimeters that you've seen on any of your engagements?
I can speak to that one if you want. I definitely have seen sort of the worst case scenario where, from the HMI, we've seen users browsing to things like Facebook and LinkedIn. And I mean, that is an example of a really hard environment to defend. And so, I mean, that's just one example. I'm sure everybody on the panel has seen similar things, but it's interesting.
I'll speak to that. So on several pen tests, we have, as well as architecture reviews, and in some cases, we've seen environments that forego a DMZ, allow connections directly from corporate into the OT environments. In some cases, those are engineering workstations, as often are kind of trope at this point. But in other cases, that's direct historian data flowing straight through. Often historians will bypass the DMZ or not properly segment them into a place where there is some funneling of data. Other places, really porous firewall rule sets. Allow any's are especially bad. Even if they're IP to IP. In many cases, as pen testers, we can often find those systems. We'll search and target those out, and adversaries can do the same. And once you get on one of those, then you have a lot of opportunity in order to scan and look through and find vulnerable services or shared credentials, as we're coming up to. So there's still a lot of opportunity for compromise within those environments.
Greg or Leslie, you got anything on that?
Yeah, I'd like to add, another area that people don't talk about a lot. We're thinking more about up the Purdue model, so towards enterprise, that those pieces of segmentation. But something that still is often neglected is like backnet systems, building automation systems that can have huge consequences and also be integrated to these process networks that are neglected and not understood and not documented as well as the process networks themselves. So hugely impactful for a multitude of reasons, but certainly because of lack of perimeters between those and the process equipment, but also because they can directly have huge impacts, heating and cooling, backup power, water, et cetera, things that are essential for the process to function, and can have huge consequences on their own. So we have to think about those parts of the network as well in terms of perimeters.
Perfect, thank you. And I'm starting to get some questions to roll in as well. So this is great. One thing I did want to add is I would imagine that the poor security perimeter problem is exacerbated by the limited to no visibility. Like they go hand in hand. So if you have two together, then it's really bad. There's a question here on separate domain credentials. I'm going to wait till we get to that metric real quick to answer that one live. And then there's a question here about do we consider it a good practice to use allow listing and IP whitelist for connections between Purdue assets as a compensating control? Any thoughts from any of the panelists on that?
I will go ahead and talk to that. I think in many cases, it's definitely a valid control that can be placed in there. The biggest challenge is the environment properly segmented to begin with in order to actually enforce that? In many cases, if it's just an Ethernet switched environment, it's very difficult to actually implement something like that at an IP level. And often cases that option isn't realistically there. And so that's usually what we've found is there needs to be additional segmentation before we can actually try and implement some type of allow listing within the environment.
Thanks, Todd. It looks like there's a question here Leslie's going to answer. The question is, how often are VLANs treated as security boundaries that you've seen?
All the time. It's a very de facto. There's a lot of Cisco environments and Juniper environments out there in these industrial networks now. It's very, very common. And of course, you know, and I'm sure Todd can talk to this more. Layer 2 attacks are definitely a real thing. We see a lot of exposed layer 2 protocols and switching protocols in industrial networks. Things like BTP are often problematic. So yeah, that's definitely something to talk to, and it's something we see used quite a bit.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree that especially in the OT environments where the configurations are often default, we use a lot of that both for compromise, but also much more effectively in mapping out the environment. CDP and other a great place to harness a lot more information as well.
Thanks. And this one's for all of you panelists here. Are there certain verticals that you see? Because, you know, we assess a number of very different verticals. Is there verticals that you see that are doing well with network segmentation versus some that maybe are still struggling a little bit?
Yeah, I'll throw in ones that are really struggling right now is manufacturing. Manufacturing is usually the one that struggles the most. There's small margins and not a lot of funding for cybersecurity and not a lot of funding for IT infrastructure. And so usually ends up being one of the more problematic verticals.
I would say in general, I will go to the other side of that spectrum and say that it seems like electric has really upped their game in quite a few ways. They're really trying. So I think in a lot of cases, the electric sector is doing really well. What we find in most cases, though, I think is the ones that have emphasized that back with their vendors. Those that have actually put it into some form of contract requirement in order to push their vendors to help them with segmentation instead of just defaulting to whatever the vendor believes is best for them.
I would add to that.
Go ahead, Gus.
Onto the electric point that Todd just made. You know, things like American Public Power Association, that consortiums of smaller utilities who are maybe need some resources around education and stuff. They have really done a lot of good work to try to bring everybody up collectively. And I just think that it's worth mentioning that, like, you know, where there's distributed small organizations, it's good for sort of these collective organizations to help the case.
Thanks. I've got a question to somebody has asked to recap kind of what these percentages and things mean on the screen. And I apologize that it's my fault here. So these are the percentages of engagements that included a finding related to these categories. And so what this would mean here is 86% of the engagements that the services team executed this year or last year had findings related to limited or no visibility, meaning that they weren't doing network monitoring into their OT segment, or they were just doing it in IT and the IT-OT boundary, but nothing within the OT. Poor security perimeters is talking about ones that had findings related to porous firewall rules, NEs, stuff like that. And then external connections to OT, these are ones that had findings related to, like Gus mentioned, people going to Facebook from OT networks, which is a horrible idea. Please don't do that. Shared IT credentials. This one is shared credentials is a category I've lumped together here. What this is talking about, like shared Active Directories between an IT network and an OT network. Could just be, shared NTLM, NTLM hashes and things like that, as well as use of default passwords and default accounts. I consider that a shared credential. It's just a shared credential that is shared with the entire world. So that's kind of what we mean when we say these things. Thank you for that question. I'm sure others had it as well. I do want to move to external connections real quick. Like I said, this one's talking about direct connections into the OT outside of the OT network. And so, Gus, you actually led a series of remote access hunts over the course of the year. This would be a great time to talk about some of those findings that you had there and deep dive into those.
Sure. It's remote access, as people suspect, is pretty prevalent. And I guess the biggest takeaway is really how much different vendor requirements drive it. So in some cases where we saw, a customer with multiple different mechanisms, different tools or things in their environment, it was really driven by, one vendor needed this tool, TeamViewer, say, to like talk to this piece of equipment. Another vendor had their own requirements, and it's a real challenge on the customer to try to leverage that and try to gather it all in, because the complexity makes the monitoring and makes the tracking of that really challenging. There's a lot of trust that comes in there, both on the device that they're using, the tool that they're using, and the vendor themselves. And that was the biggest thing, was how much vendors really drive the different tools that are used. There was definitely some like internal teams, maybe one team needed to access the historian and they had their own mechanism to do that, but it was largely driven by vendor requirements. And that's a place, to try to push back and simplify. But that was the big takeaway for me, Jacob.
Thanks. So we talked about, so in the year in review, we talked about some of the strategies that people could, that defenders could use for deploying remote access. And one of those things was around isolation playbooks as part of their IR. I was hoping Leslie could elaborate a little more on some isolation playbooks or just playbooks in general.
Yeah, so I previously mentioned that if you don't do planning and preparation for incident response, it's going to cost you time and resources at the beginning of incident response, because those things ultimately do have to get done. Playbooks are a huge help with you having a smooth, trouble-free incident response experience as much as you can in a crisis where you've had some kind of intrusion. And something that isn't really covered in IT playbooks and IT incident response is, how are we going to disconnect this thing? Okay, the room is on fire and we need to keep the fire from spreading into the next room. And that's where playbooks for disconnection of the OT levels or the entire OT environments from the rest of the network become really crucial. Because again, these are not IT business networks. These are things that can impact human life and safety, the environment, your very expensive physical kinetic equipment and facilities. So if there's a potential for there being something that could cause physical harm, certainly one of your containment tactics is often get this network disconnected. And that can be trickier than you think. It doesn't necessarily just mean going out there with an axe and cutting some cables. You need to know which cables you're going to disconnect and who's going to do that. And if there is some kind of software disconnection, who has the ability to do that, to log into your routers or your switches? So can't emphasize this enough. I see it a lot on tabletop exercises that we'll talk about later, but have a plan for how you're going to cut off and segment various parts of your network quickly in an emergency, and in a way that isn't going to impact your operations or your incident response. Because I've also seen people try to do this in an emergency without a plan and cut themselves off from all of their forensics and incident response documentation resources. So this is an important thing, everybody, to plan for in advance.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leslie. I do want to clarify here. Someone has a question. It says, operators usually want always on or shared logins in control room, whereas cyber wants separate OT credentials and log in and log out between shifts. Thoughts on this? Just in general, when I talk about shared credentials, I'm not talking about that kind of shared credentials. And I'm interested to hear from the panel. But personally, I'm okay with operators in a control room having the login operator one and they all use the same one. I'm okay with that. What I'm talking about is if that is operator one login there, and then back in the corporate office where he checks his email or her email, that's the same login, operator one. Like, that's what I'm talking about is I want to avoid a single compromise happening on the IT side that allows them to traverse all the way down into the OT network. That's what I mean here with the shared credentials. I'm actually not terribly against like local operators sharing credentials. I understand it's not typically a best practice, but it's for the use case and the operability and things that they need, it's a necessary situation, at least in my opinion. But if anyone on the panel disagrees, I'm certainly open to hear it.
So I would augment that, Jacob. I strongly agree that that those types of credentials aren't typically what we're looking at. But there are a couple of caveats to that particular discussion that are important to understand. One of the first is, in many cases, those shared credentials may just be default credentials. The types where no one changed it and or a vendor set it up for somebody and it's highly predictable. Those are problematic in many, many cases. The other component to that, though, really comes down to how do we utilize those? And in many cases, again, we can set up opportunities for detection. So other examples of that, credentials where you can log in interactively, but being used without interactive logins. So those are great opportunities for detection where afterwards an incident responder can come in and actually catch what's going on, or you should be able to catch those live. In most of those cases, that shared credential is being used interactively, but as a pen tester, we're using them in ways that really should not be allowed still. And so there are lots and lots of opportunities for detection there that just go unutilized or unrecognized in many of those cases.
I would add to that too. I mean, when you're talking about shared credentials, and can't forget about things like default passwords on equipment, and you know what I mean. And one anecdote of a customer that their IT environment was pretty well compromised, including their domain controller, and the fact that they didn't utilize the IT domain controller to control assets within the OT environment, save their hide. And so it's a really important practice to try to execute.
Perfect. Thank you all. Leslie, this question is for you, but everyone else can chime in as well. Like, how does like shared credentials complicate incident response when you've got a shared credential situation? Maybe you're in a compromise and it's shared on the IT and the OT side. How does that complicate your incident response?
Well, just like confusion and timing and, you know, lack of a central NTP source on a network, it can make it more difficult. The point of incident response is to create a timeline and a narrative of what happened. And the more ambiguity there is about who logged into what at what time, it just becomes harder to write that story about who did what to the computer and what they damaged or stole or tampered with. So having shared credentials can certainly lend to that ambiguity about what actually happened. Was it Joe who logged in, or was it Susan who logged in, and what did they do to the device, and were they on shift? It's just harder to have accountability for what happened on the network in general.
Cool. Greg, what about comparing verticals and how this goes for any of these findings?
Yeah, I think, I think oil and gas is doing a pretty good job of eliminating shared credentials. It's interesting to me as you step back and you look at environments that are unique, right? Every refinery, every oil and gas facility is kind of different. And so they're going to have a different layout and a different network topology, even if they're under the same organization. So just kind of by the uniqueness, it rules out some of those shared credentials on a mass, on a mass scale. But when you turn and you look at something like transportation, where the same type of equipment is deployed across the entire subset of a nation or a region, it becomes a logistic and management nightmare for those security professionals. And so they tend, what I've seen is it tends to be left in a default mode or a widely spread accessible mode where a shared credential is used across the entire deployment of a subset of equipment. I don't know if anybody else has anything to chime in, but I've seen it both ways.
Thanks, Greg. That's awesome perspective. I have a question about external connections and how it relates to perimeter exposure. Have you seen any of these things in any of your recent cases, whether they're IR or whether or anything? Leslie or anyone on the panel?
Yeah, definitely. It's something we see repeatedly. And I know there's a lot of variation in those numbers, but we see a lot of different adversaries. I think the reason, first, I think there was a question about why we see so much variation in these external connection numbers. Well, one of those reasons is that adversaries target different things at different times in different campaigns. And we have seen a lot of adversaries looking at services like Shodan and finding exposed systems lately. That, of course, goes in waves with campaigns, but you really need to be checking your external IP space exposure on Shodan or similar services and seeing what you have exposed out there. Because it's not even necessarily vulnerable like perimeter gateways, but sometimes it's like hosts directly exposed to the internet because somebody needed quick access to something. I mean, we've been in a pandemic and people have wanted easy remote access to things. So we definitely see that as a vector for intrusions. Adversaries doing large scale scanning across, the internet for exposed hosts in industrial type systems, which is deeply problematic.
Yeah, I would
go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Jacob. I would agree with that rather strongly. And in fact, on pen tests, we've also found cell modems connecting things in, found them on Shodan, and then coupled that with the shared credentials or actually default credentials to actually get into the devices, which are actually sitting right on the OT network. That kind of, we understand that there's a lot of blurred lines between all of this, but in a lot of cases, these overlap in those ways to make it actually far too easy for this to come together.
Thanks, Todd. I'm going to move on to the next section. There's still a bunch of questions and we're going to get to them at the end. I just want to make sure we cover some of the other stuff. So don't worry if you have a question on these findings, I'll circle back. So let's talk a little bit about crown jewel analysis. There was a section in the year in review talking about how Dragos does crown jewel analysis and some of the typical outputs and things that we have there and how we use it to help folks. And so I do want to ask Greg here. Greg is our resident crown jewel analysis expert. Do you want to tell us what is crown jewel analysis and how can people use it?
Yeah, absolutely. So Dragos defined crown jewel analysis as a method of analysis used to identify key network terrain within an ICS OT environment based on the identification of critical business unit processes, their functional dependency on control system assets to ultimately produce an output. By understanding and aligning this type of analytic methodology, and it could be, it's very similar to the Department of Energy's CCE and other types of framework. But understanding and aligning a type of analytic methodology to the functional output of a system or the primary purpose of that system, you can work to isolate and capture high impact cybersecurity scenarios that an environment may face. So with this model, we do that by linking these dependencies of functional industrial processes that are isolated within system ownership, critical systems within the operational business units, to the ICS OT network topology. Those dependencies that are identified as key network terrain. They're required for that process output. Those key network the key network terrain can be married then with security practices and mitigations to proportionately and prescriptively apply network barriers necessary to lower this high impact cybersecurity risk that most ICS environments face. So we start with the high impact areas first, the highest criticality areas first, and then work our way down through it.
Thanks, Greg. So Gus, how would a hunter use a CJA? Like, as you're threat hunting, how is CJA applicable to you?
So yeah, so I mean, it's certainly really important context. Once you get out inside the perimeter, what are those assets that are going to have the biggest impact? And so, you know, using threat intelligence to look for known vulnerabilities on level 1 ICS devices and looking for those kinds of things within the traffic. Also, just in general, looking for changes in behavior for those devices. Are there more connections? Are they connecting to IP addresses that shouldn't be happening? Are there new function codes within those ICS protocols that you're observing that hadn't been there prior? Are there changes like downloads or switches, you know, faults, or, you know, go into program mode, things like that? You can look for all those kinds of things. Other things, you know, looking for exploits within the ICS protocols themselves that are sometimes used as techniques to evade, you know, an ICS aware firewall, for instance. If there's an exploit within that protocol, you may be able to bypass that firewall and still get access to that crown jewel. And so those are some of the things that we try to, you know, we focus our hunts on those devices that are going to have the greatest impact, and then sort of how those might be exploited. If that makes sense.
So Leslie, how does CJA help incident response?
Computer forensics is not like it is on TV in real life. I don't turn on my magical blue lights and suddenly I have my investigation done and answers to all my questions about what happened on the network. It's time consuming. And so I have to prioritize my investigations too. So just like my colleagues were just talking about, I need to focus my efforts, my most strenuous forensics efforts and my top experts on the systems that are going to have most real consequential impact to the industrial network. And I'll move on to other things later, but we need to know what's going on with those first, right? To know if they're safe to operate, know if we need to replace them, if we need to do other mitigations. So it's a huge, huge deal to me as well.
So I'll jump in here as well. In a lot of cases, as pen testers, we love to try and have an understanding of what the crown jewels are. In many cases, that's because what we're going to try and do is try and look at ways that we could do reconnaissance on those, actually understand what their points are, understand what the functions are, how we could potentially impact those in different ways, and propose those types of impacts back. The other piece on that is we could then start to show how those would be detectable events, things that with monitoring, appropriate logging, or other aspects, how would any of the other functions, incident response, hunt, or otherwise, how would they detect us? Because ultimately, that's one of the things that we're trying to push the bar forward on as pen testers, right? Is what is it that we can do, prove out those proof of concepts, and then show how we could be caught, because ultimately that's what we want to do, is catch it before it causes us a problem.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, panel. Great responses there. I'm going to move to our average TTX findings here. This was also in the UN review report. I'm going to ask Greg to, I'm sorry, I'm going to ask Leslie, what is a TTX and why should everyone do them before we jump into these scores?
So an incident is an emergency situation. You're in crisis, you're dealing with panicking people. And the important thing to deal with a crisis is having good processes and playbooks, but also having drilled them a lot. And have it be second nature of how to deal with that emergency. It's the same thing all kinds of different emergency responders do. And that's what we do as tabletop exercises. We sit down in a safe environment where there isn't really anything on fire and there isn't really anybody in reality attacking. And we play out these scenarios of, let's walk through our step-by-step response to various types of cybersecurity events and potential incidents. So from the ground up, we have this scenario. This is what we saw. When do we activate our incident response? When do we move to, declaring a formal incident at a specific severity? Who do we communicate with and how do we do that? And then how do we perform our forensics processes and who's going to do that? And we throw some wrenches in the mix and we play out this gamified scenario and make sure that we know what to do and see where our roadblocks are. And I can't stress enough how important these are to knowing whether your real plans for how to respond to an incident are going to actually work in reality. So we provide this as a service at Dragos. We go out and we provide either, pre-developed or custom scenarios related to the customer specific concerns. And we game them out and we see how their response teams and their IT teams do in a real life scenario situation. And they're very valuable. I have had a lot of success educating people using these.
Thanks. That's great. And, this would be very similar to things like GridX and some of those exercises that DOE puts on is a very similar kind of situation. Greg, what core competency, which are listed here on the screen, these are the core competencies that I'm referring to. Which one do you think posed the most challenge to the OT industry overall, or which few? And maybe dive into these results a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers represent themselves. Detection and activation elevation, the very first two muscle movements of any incident response. So my opinion is organizations sometimes struggle on the front end of their planning to develop an intelligence lifecycle within their organization, right? How do they consume intelligence? How do they use that intelligence to update their posture, to detecting events? And the second part of that is visibility, right? Having limited visibility within your ICS OT environment means that you have limited yourself to detecting events. In addition to that, what do you do with it? How do you activate and elevate? We talk about this a lot, and I know that Leslie and I both have seen this a lot in tabletop exercises. So the thresholds for declaring an incident depend on a ton of factors, such as recognizing the threat behaviors and the tactics that are there. The operational impacts to bottom line operations, have to do with categorizing the severity and the assumed risk. So identifying those factors that contribute to the cyber risk thresholds and clearly defining those in the incident response plan adds speed and agility in your activation and your activation process on the front end.
Thanks, Greg. Does anyone, including Greg, have any key takeaways from the TTXs this year?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in. I'm sure Leslie also could add to this, but even if there's limited visibility, you're limited in your detection capabilities, and you haven't integrated your intel life cycle. I think the one thing that I've seen this year is many clients are able to compensate that with a strong communication plan within their incident response plan. So the capability to remediate and recover without complications goes back to having that strong, effective communication up front, right? The need to respond appropriately to a detected event is immediate, but it's directly followed by the need to communicate the action plan. So you can again add speed and agility to your plan by effectively communicating up front.
So it's similar, like if maybe you're struggling with detection at first, but and even activating, identifying that incident and actually elevating it as an incident versus just a process anomaly or something like that. Even if that, is a bump in the road for you, if you have strong communication abilities, you may be able to eventually recover without as many challenges as you would think. Simply like you're just stating that communication is really a key to a TTX and to incident response in general and things like that. I think that's a good takeaway. Obviously, we need to increase the detection and things like that, but communication is certainly a big part. I'm going to move on to the recommendations that we have for the year. And so any of our panelists want to talk about like maybe what is a defensible architecture and why is it our #1 recommendation?
Yeah, I think I mean, I can start with that. I think having a defendable architecture means knowing yourself better than anybody, right? You have to understand where your cybersecurity risks are. You have to have the asset inventory associated with that, the visibility over the top of that. And you have to, even if you don't have large budgets to, build a moat around everything and segment everything, where there are exceptions, you should be able to apply visibility, logging and monitoring over the top of that with pretty well identified traversal paths and the policies that go with that. So I don't know if anybody else would like to chime in on that.
I have a question here that correlates with one of these. So there's a question here. It says, any good practice on patching and firmware updates on level 1 devices? Looks like Gus said he could answer that one. I think it goes along with our vulnerability management and what we mean here about like key vulnerability management. But Gus, did you want to go ahead and answer that question?
Yeah, I would just, with that one, I would just stress the use, and it's not really related to much of the year in review, but stress the use of having a development lab and testing out firmware and patches in a lab environment, not in production, monitoring that environment, and also checking hashes and signatures with the vendor to make sure that what you actually installed is what they're saying is the right version. That was basically the quick answer for it.
Thanks. Now here we have, we're talking about remote access authentication here, our third recommendation. So what would be, if you could only do one thing, what would be the most effective control for remote access authentication?
I would pick multi-factor personally. Multi-factor is a huge roadblock to intrusions via remote access. That'd be my personal call. There's a lot of great options here.
Yeah, I agree as well. I know I'm not on the panel, but I certainly agree. Multi-factor is one of our top recommendations that I see a lot of. I do want to highlight the key vulnerability management here. Like talking about that, maybe not every vulnerability that comes out you have to patch. Maybe if anyone on the team maybe wants to talk about that, feel free.
I can take that one really quick. A lot of the key vulnerability management for us really boils down to if it's highly prevalent, if it's in many places, oftentimes it can be one of the ones that enables us to pivot through systems. So if it's in your DMZ, in your OT environment, and in your enterprise environment, you need to focus on trying to get your vendors to help you patch that and emphasize that. If it's firmware sitting on a PLC, it may not really be important at that point because there's so much effort that has to go in just to get to the point where we can actually exploit that or do anything about it. So it really is a big factor in understanding the environment, and that comes back to that defensible architecture, that idea that if I have to go through the enterprise environment, the DMZ, and it's very difficult to get access to all of those systems, and there's lots of monitoring involved in that, it's going to make it very difficult for me to actually get to that system to even exploit it. So why do I need to patch it tomorrow?
That's a great point, that all of these controls are related together and they work together, right? Like I haven't spent a lot of time talking about network monitoring or the panel on this slide specifically, but that's because visibility and network monitoring has been all throughout our presentation. And network monitoring is important. You can't understand what's on your network if you're not listening to it, right? I do want to get to some of this, to the fifth one here with the incident response plan. I do want to talk about question here for Leslie is, Does the response plan have to be specific to OT? What is the value there? And how often should I test my IRP?
Yeah, so it doesn't necessarily have to be a separate physical document, but you do need to have a separate plan for OT. The operational needs are so different, the people involved, the communications paths, and the decision-making processes about things like containment and even how you do forensics in these environments are so totally different from IT. If you don't have an OT incident response section in your incident response plan or a separate OT incident response plan, I really encourage you to take a look at that right away. Because all of those different typical sections of your incident response plan, like containment and forensics, identification, things like that, are going to be different in that environment. These are not one-for-one things that you can transfer, not even your forensics tools. You need to explore this.
Thanks. That's perfect. So I'm going to move to see if we can answer more of these questions and answers that are flowing in. We've answered a number of them during the webinar live here, but I want to go ahead and ask the panelists to go through here. Any that you see that you'd like to answer live, whether you're typing them or answer just speaking out, please feel free to do that. So let's take a moment and go ahead and do that. If there's anyone you have on hand, please go ahead and speak up and go.
I did have a question that's always solid for everybody, which is the cultural divide between IT and OT and why we think that's a problem and how to fix it. Yes, I like to call that marriage counseling. It's open lines of communications mostly. It's understanding, empathy for what the other team needs and what their priorities are in business. Understand that your operator's priority is not cybersecurity. It is keeping things operating, keeping them operating safely. And there's also different terminology. We speak different languages. So good lines of open communication and listening to the other team are really key elements there.
I have a question here. Maybe somebody can help me answer. Is periodic antivirus updates sufficient for industrial control systems if the system is used as not as like, looks like they are talking about like air gap, if the system is not connected to an external network? I would first make sure you validate that it really is air gapped. A lot of times I'm a big fan of the air gap myth. I don't think it really exists. It's just what we call a low latency network. It just takes a little bit longer to get there. But what do you think about periodic antivirus updates for that? Is that sufficient or not?
So I would take that. I do not believe so. I think that antivirus, the industry has long said that it's really just a stopgap, and most of it is still signature based. So no, however, leveraging it for logging and for additional information is really the important part to take away from that. And I would also emphasize, there was another question on data diodes. That all of that lends back to, I agree with Jacob that I think that the air gap is often a myth. Usually there is some form of connectivity. We're finding it more and more common. And that goes back to Leslie and I's conversations earlier about cell modems and other components like that. There is often a way to either get out of these networks or get into them. It just may be one direction. Still leveraging that is definitely a possibility. So we find that often, no, antivirus is not sufficient in and by itself.
Can I make a tag on that last bit about the data diode piece? So I think there is a not necessarily for data diodes, but a really important use case consideration is what is the data for, and is it better to somehow relay that information, that data out to a device that sits on a DMZ or somewhere else, so you don't need to allow, you can limit the number of users and access into the IoT environment. So even if, you know, that's all, I guess that's all I would say is try to figure out what the use case is, and if you can just move that data into a safer place to be used, that's certainly an important step.
Leslie, did you have more? Oh, go ahead.
Somebody had a tangential question to that one that I'll grab along with that, which is what about application whitelisting? And we all love it. You won't see much EDR or application whitelisting that you can actually practically deploy in industrial networks. The vendors typically won't allow it, and it can potentially break process things. If you have that, if you've talked to your vendor and your engineers and you're able to do something like deploy application whitelisting, sure, yeah, it's awesome. Same with EDR. Yeah, we love it. It's wonderful. It's just there is going to be very, very, very substantial limitations to being able to use those tools in OT.
We got a few minutes left. I'm still digging through here. I see an interesting one I'm curious about. I'm going to put this one to Todd, but certainly anyone can answer here. Do you have an opinion of one-way AD trust below the ICS firewall to allow corporate AD accounts to be used in the ICS space?
Yes, quite frankly, we often don't like to see that. There was actually a related question as well on what is the importance of setting up a dedicated AD on OT. Personally, we like to see separate AD for those, and oftentimes we're not fans of having trusts between the two. We can often use that in order to pivot. So those and some additional reconnaissance. There's a lot of ties between those two through that trust that really enables us. So in most cases, no, we don't like to see it.
Todd, I have another follow-up for you. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to couple on with, I see a follow on with what type of pen test do we conduct on OT?
That's what I was going to ask you. You read my mind.
Perfect. So in most cases, we prefer white box or crystal box testing. In a lot of cases, we're going to not throw exploits, to be quite honest. In most cases, we don't like to actually exploit live inside of an environment. We want a test environment, a test, or we want it set up in such a way that we aren't going to bring down a production system. And so when we're doing that, we really want to make sure that that's well understood. So we're going to do that in that way. The other side of that goes back to another question that came up, which is that IT-OT divide that Leslie mentioned. Ultimately, we see ourselves as a bridge for both sides of that. Trying to really understand what the engineers' concerns are, because they're looking at the process. They want to understand how their process can fail, or the things that they had to make exceptions on or take risks on, and how those are problematic. In most cases, there's a big gap in, it is a lot easier to do something on the process than the engineers want to believe. And that's what we're there to prove. The flip side of that, it is a lot harder than most of the IT folks think it is in order to do this. This is not something that you stumble in and just create mass chaos and problems. In most cases, the engineers have done their homework and the process safely shuts down, to be quite honest. It is much harder to do something very, very bad inside of this than the IT folks really understand or believe.
Thanks, Todd. I'm going to ask one more question. I'm going to target this one to Greg, and then we'll wrap here. One of the question is, isn't CJA subjective based on what the customer deems important, or is this what the hunt team identifies as what's important? So I think that's a little bit, Greg, I think you can answer that pretty easily. Yep.
Yeah, I'll try. So I do believe that each organization, whether they're complex or whether they're simple organizations, if they're an industrial organization, there is a key set of business units that contribute to the production output of that organization. If take a water utility, for example, if you have a water, and Gus, chime in, please. I know your background is water, but if you have a water utility organization, you might have several sub-organizations underneath of it, but really the thing that makes it go are those individual facilities and the sites producing water within that. So then it becomes not subjective. It's an engineering problem after that, right? These engineering system or industrial systems contribute most to the output. You can link that back to the dependencies of the ICS OT topology and the network, which is really what CJA is all about, is trying to figure out what those critical dependencies are from the functional output of the system back to the network topology that is relied upon.
So Thanks, Greg, and thanks to everyone on my panel, and thank you for everyone that joined us today and being a part of our Year in Review webinar series. We thank you for all that you do to help keep industrial operations safe. I want you to take care, and thank you so much. And I look forward to doing this again next year, and appreciate your time. And thanks again, panel. You were wonderful.